Imagine this, a quiet evening in a park, the sun beginning to set, and the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the air. But suddenly, something dark and disturbing unfolds. A group of skinheads, filled with hatred and prejudice, spot a black teenager walking alone. With cruel intentions and taunting smirks, they close in on him, surrounding him, ready to humiliate and frighten him purely because of his skin color. He feels trapped, helpless, his heart pounding as the reality of his situation sinks in. But what these bullies don't realize is that someone is watching from nearby, his father, a police officer, who's about to turn the tables in the most unexpected way. Before we dive into this intense story, let's get to know you. Drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments below. We want you to know how much each of you means to us. Your thoughts, support, and every single comment help us grow our channel and reach more people with important stories like this one. You're not just viewers, you're a crucial part of our community, and we're deeply grateful for each and every one of you. Now, are you ready to hear what happened next in this powerful story? The warm evening air filled the park as the young teenager strolled along the path, unwinding from a long day at school. He had been looking forward to this moment of peace all day, a quiet escape into the open spaces and tall trees that lined the walking trails. The light was soft, with the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Families laughed together on benches, joggers paced by with steady steps, and the sounds of birds filled the air, all coming together in a harmonious backdrop that made the park feel safe and inviting. With his backpack slung over one shoulder, he took slow, relaxed steps, occasionally kicking a pebble along the path as he went. This was his time to unwind, to forget about homework and responsibilities for a while. The park had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could let his thoughts wander and enjoy the serenity of nature. He breathed deeply, feeling the tension of the day start to dissolve with each step. In his hand, he held his phone, occasionally glancing at messages from friends who were planning their weekend meetup. A small smile crossed his face as he thought about how he would join them soon, but for now, he was content just to walk alone. He paused by a bench under a large tree, looking around at the scenery. The golden leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and he felt a sense of calm and freedom that he always cherished during these quiet walks. Completely at ease, he had no way of knowing that the calm of his evening was about to be shattered. As the teenager continued his walk, a group of young men on the other side of the park noticed him. They stood clustered together, their shaved heads and dark clothing giving them an unmistakable air of aggression. These were skinheads, known in the area for their hostility and dangerous reputation. Their laughter was harsh, their movements restless, and as they spotted the young black teenager, their expressions shifted, turning from casual amusement to something much darker. One of them, tall and muscular, narrowed his eyes, his lips curling into a twisted smirk as he nudged his friends, directing their attention toward the lone figure strolling along the path. Slowly, their conversation faded as each of them turned to look, their gazes hardening with a shared sense of contempt. They exchanged quick, knowing glances, as if silently agreeing on what they would do next. Here was someone they saw as vulnerable, alone, and, in their twisted minds, an easy target for the hatred simmering within them. The leader of the group stepped forward, cracking his knuckles, his eyes filled with a sense of smug superiority. He looked back at his friends with a grin, feeling emboldened by their numbers. In that moment, they knew they had the advantage. There were 5 of them, strong and intimidating, against one teenager who was entirely unaware of their presence. Without a word, they began moving toward him, their strides purposeful, almost predatory. The air around them grew charged, the carefree energy of the park replaced by a tension that seemed to follow them with each step. Some of the park's other visitors noticed their focused, menacing approach and quickly moved out of the way, sensing that nothing good would come from crossing paths with these men. As they drew closer, their expressions grew even colder, the disdain in their eyes visible, radiating with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. To them, this young teenager represented everything they despised. They relished the thought of cornering him, of instilling fear, of asserting what they believed was their dominance. Their footsteps grew heavier, more deliberate, as they closed the distance, preparing to make their presence known and unleash the cruelty they had come to see as their right. For the teenager, still unaware, this was just another peaceful walk. But for the skinheads approaching, it was the beginning of a twisted game, and they felt invincible, confident in their numbers and certain that no one would dare to stop them. The teenager continued along the path, his mind drifting, blissfully unaware of the group closing in on him from behind. The skinheads moved quickly, their footsteps growing more deliberate as they closed the distance, positioning themselves to trap him. They spread out, taking up space on either side of the path, cutting off any possible escape route. Their faces were twisted with contempt and cruel anticipation, each one feeding off the other's hostility as they tightened their circle around him. One of them, the tallest, moved in front, stepping into the teenager's line of sight. The boy's peaceful expression shifted to confusion as he looked up, startled to find his path blocked. Before he could react, another stepped to his side, and then another, their postures aggressive, bodies tense. They had him surrounded, each of them standing just a little too close, their presence invasive and threatening. The open space he had enjoyed moments ago suddenly felt suffocating. The teenager's heartbeat quickened, a sense of unease washing over him as he realized he was trapped. He looked from one face to the next, noticing the sneers and cold, unwelcoming stares. There was no friendliness here, no casual curiosity, only raw, unmasked hostility. He swallowed, his mind racing, trying to comprehend what was happening and why these strangers were closing in on him. "Hey, kid," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. The others laughed, their laughter harsh and mocking, a sound that echoed ominously in the now quiet part of the park. The leader took a step closer, his eyes filled with a hatred that the boy could feel, sharp and cold, like the bite of a winter wind. It was a look that made his skin crawl, a look that told him this was far from a harmless encounter. The teenager felt a surge of panic. He glanced around, searching for a way out, but every direction was blocked by a figure looming over him, each one radiating hostility. The escape routes he might have used had vanished in an instant, replaced by the presence of these men who seemed intent on making him feel as helpless as possible. They had surrounded him completely, relishing the power they held, the look of growing fear on his face only fueling their cruel satisfaction. He was cornered, alone, and the realization of his vulnerability hit him with a chilling force. As the group tightened their circle around him, the teenager felt the weight of their contempt pressing down, suffocating any hope he had for escape. The leader of the group sneered, his lips curling into a mocking smile as he looked the boy up and down with disgust. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, leaning in as if to examine him, but his gaze held nothing but cold amusement. "Well, look what we've got here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Out for a little stroll, are we?" His words were laced with mockery, each syllable stretched out to make it sound like he was addressing someone who couldn't possibly belong here. The others laughed, a low, cruel sound that seemed to echo in the quiet space around them. Another skinhead, standing to the teenager's right, leaned in, giving him an exaggerated once-over, as if he were studying something unworthy of his time. "You think you're pretty brave, huh? Walking around here like you own the place," he jeered, his voice tinged with disdain. The teenager glanced from one man to the next, feeling their words cut into him like icy blades. They weren't shouting or raising their voices, but the cruelty in their tone was chilling, each word sharpened to a point, designed to humiliate and belittle. It was as though they were toying with him, each man feeding off the other's hostility, their laughter growing louder as they watched the fear flicker in his eyes. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue," another one taunted, his voice barely a whisper but filled with malice. He leaned in close, his face inches from the teenagers, his breath warm against the boy's cold skin. The teenagers tried to look away, but the man grabbed his chin, forcing him to look him in the eye. "We're talking to you, boy. You think you can just ignore us?" The leader chuckled darkly, crossing his arms and taking pleasure in the teenager's discomfort. "Bet you think you're special, huh? Just strolling around like you belong here." His voice was laced with condescension, as though the very idea of this boy existing in their space was offensive. The teenager swallowed hard, his mouth dry, as he felt the weight of their words sink in. He was outnumbered, surrounded, and each insult seemed colder, sharper, meant to strip away his dignity bit by bit. Their voices echoed with scorn, and each chuckle, each sneer made it clear they saw him as less than human, someone they could humiliate simply for existing. The air around them grew colder, the atmosphere thick with hostility as the skinheads shifted from mocking laughter to more pointed, vicious words. Their sneers deepened, their gazes dark with hatred, and they made no effort to hide the loathing that colored their expressions. One of them, with a twisted grin, took a step closer and spat out, "What makes you think you belong here, huh? This isn't your kind of place." His voice dripped with malice, each word sharpened to wound. The others nodded in agreement, their faces hard with contempt as they fed off each other's animosity. Another skinhead, his voice mocking but laced with a venomous edge, added, "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place? Look at you, out of place, like some stray." He looked the teenager up and down with a disgusted expression, as if the very sight of him was offensive. The leader of the group leaned in, his eyes narrowed, filled with a simmering rage. "People like you don't belong here. You think we're gonna just let you wander around? Think again," he hissed, his words biting into the boy, each one meant to make him feel small and powerless. The teenager could feel the sting of their words, each insult hitting him like a punch. His heart pounded, his throat dry as he tried to stay calm, but their voices surrounded him, cutting into him, stripping away his sense of safety. They continued to hurl racially charged slurs, each word colder and harsher, as though trying to erase his dignity and reduce him to something lesser in their eyes. One of them spat on the ground near his feet, a gesture of utter contempt. "You think you're equal to us? You're nothing," he sneered, his eyes hard and unyielding. Their words were filled with hatred, each syllable designed to remind him of how they saw him, not as a person, but as someone they believed was beneath them. The teenager felt the weight of their scorn, the insults digging deep into him. He could see the hatred burning in their eyes, a hatred that ran far deeper than words. Their words were weapons, each one aimed to hurt, humiliate, and diminish, and he felt the sting of each one, unable to escape their barrage of cruelty. As the skinheads continued their barrage of insults, their laughter grew louder, more twisted, echoing off the trees and the nearby paths. It was a harsh, mocking laughter, filled with a dark, cruel satisfaction. They were enjoying this moment, feeding off the fear they saw flicker in the teenager's eyes, taking pleasure in the power they held over him. The leader threw his head back and laughed, his voice sharp and grating, as if he had just heard the most amusing joke. "Look at him," he sneered, gesturing to his friends, inviting them to join in his sick enjoyment. "He actually thinks he can just walk around here like it's no big deal. Pathetic." The others joined in, their laughter full of scorn, looking at the boy as if he were nothing more than a spectacle, something to be laughed at and ridiculed. One of them nudged his friend and pointed at the teenager with a smirk, as though the mere sight of him was somehow ridiculous, an affront to their twisted sense of superiority. "What's the matter?" one of them sneered through a chuckle. "You scared? You thought you'd just come for a little walk and not have to deal with the real world." He laughed again, the sound dripping with condescension, as if the boy's fear was something to be mocked, something that gave them even more satisfaction. The teenager stood frozen, feeling each laugh pierce him deeper, the derision stripping away any sense of safety he'd felt moments before. The way they looked at him, with eyes full of disdain and twisted amusement, made him feel small, as though he were an object of their ridicule rather than a person. Another skinhead leaned in closer, a cruel smirk on his face, and said, "Look at him shaking. What's wrong, kid? Thought you were safe here?" He laughed again, a harsh, barking sound, and his friends followed suit, their voices blending together into a dark, oppressive chorus of contempt. The teenager could feel the humiliation rising within him, their mocking laughter echoing in his mind. Every laugh, every sneer, made him feel smaller, trapped in their hateful gaze, as if their laughter alone was enough to strip away his dignity. Their enjoyment of his fear was palpable, and he realized with chilling certainty that they saw this as a game, a moment of entertainment at his expense. The leader's mocking grin twisted even further as he stepped closer to the teenager, his eyes narrowing with a sick sense of delight. Without warning, he reached out and gave the boy a hard shove, sending him stumbling backward. The force of the push was sudden and jarring, breaking through the already fragile wall of composure the teenager was desperately trying to hold onto. The group erupted in laughter again, their voices filled with cruel amusement at his unsteady footing. "What's the matter? Can't stand up straight," one of them taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. They watched as the boy regained his balance, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction, savoring the fear and humiliation that flashed in his expression. The teenager's heart raced, his mind reeling from the sudden act of violence. He instinctively glanced around, his eyes darting in search of help, but there was no one nearby who seemed willing to intervene. The surrounding park felt empty, the peaceful evening shattered by this group of men who seemed intent on making him feel as powerless as possible. Another skinhead stepped forward and gave him another shove, less forceful but filled with just as much venom. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered, his face twisted with contempt. Each push, each shove, was a reminder of how trapped he was, how completely at their mercy he felt in that moment. The teenager struggled to keep his footing, his body tense and rigid, bracing himself against the relentless intimidation. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, a growing sense of dread settling in as he realized that they wouldn't stop, not until they'd had their fill of tormenting him. The leader, emboldened by the lack of resistance, shoved him once more, this time harder, forcing the teenager to stumble back yet again. The boy's heart hammered in his chest, each push stripping away another layer of his confidence, his sense of self-worth. They laughed louder, feeding off his vulnerability, his struggle to maintain even a sliver of dignity against their ruthless aggression. With each shove and insult, the skinheads intensified their psychological assault, determined to break the teenager's spirit completely. They closed in tighter around him, their faces twisted with cruel smiles, each of them taking turns to unleash a barrage of words meant to tear him down. The leader leaned in close, his voice a low, taunting whisper that seemed to crawl under the boy's skin. "You scared yet?" he sneered, his words carrying a sinister edge. "Thought you could just walk through here like you belong? Guess you were wrong." He laughed softly, a cold sound that sent a shiver down the teenager's spine. He was so close that the boy could feel the man's breath on his face, making him shrink back instinctively. Another one of them, standing just a few feet away, began to circle him slowly, like a predator assessing its prey. "What's wrong?" he jeered. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to say anything?" The others chuckled in agreement, feeding off the fear they saw in the boy's eyes. Their words were laced with an almost gleeful malice, as if his silence, his visible terror, was exactly what they wanted. The teenager felt the walls closing in, his mind racing as he tried to hold onto some sense of control, but their voices surrounded him, stripping away his confidence bit by bit. He could feel their eyes on him, dissecting every nervous glance, every slight tremble in his hands. They wanted to see him break, to watch his fear unravel in real time. "Look at him shake," another sneered, pointing out the tremor in the boy's hands with a mocking grin. "You're nothing. Just a scared little boy pretending to be tough. You think you can stand up to us?" The words were like poison, designed to erode any shred of self-assurance he had left. They could see the fear settling into his expression, the growing realization of his helplessness reflected in his eyes, and they thrived on it. One of them leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with contempt. "No one's here to help you," he hissed. "It's just you and us." The words hung in the air, suffocating, making the teenager feel smaller and more vulnerable with each passing second. Their enjoyment of his distress was palpable, each sneer, each harsh laugh amplifying the terror they had instilled in him. They wanted him to feel isolated, utterly alone, and completely at their mercy, and in that moment, he did. As the group continued to close in, one of the skinheads glanced down at the teenager's backpack, slung over one shoulder. His eyes gleamed with fresh malice as he reached out, grabbing the strap and yanking it off the boy's shoulder with a rough, dismissive tug. The teenager instinctively tried to reach for his bag, but another skinhead stepped forward, blocking his movement with a mocking grin. "What's in here, huh?" the leader sneered, holding the backpack up and examining it like it was some ridiculous item that had no place in their world. He opened the bag with a quick, aggressive motion, pulling out its contents one by one, books, notebooks, and personal belongings scattered onto the ground with no care, each item discarded as though it were worthless. "Oh, look at this," one of them laughed, picking up a notebook and flipping through it, sneering at the neat handwriting on the pages. "What, you think studying makes you special? Makes you better than us?" He ripped a page from the notebook, crumpling it in his fist before tossing it to the ground, watching the boy's reaction with cruel satisfaction. The teenager could only stand there, his heart sinking as he watched them toss his things around, each item of personal value treated with contempt. His face flushed with humiliation, feeling powerless to stop them as they dismantled what few possessions he had brought with him. Another skinhead found a small, framed photo tucked in a side pocket, a family picture, his parents and younger sister smiling at him from the frame. The leader held up the photo, examining it with a look of disgust before giving the teenager a cold, mocking grin. "What's this, your little family? Bet they're proud of you," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he looked between the boy and the photo, as if comparing the two with disdain. Without a second thought, he dropped the picture to the ground, his foot hovering over it, a silent threat that needed no words. The teenager's eyes widened, his throat tightening as he watched helplessly. Each item they discarded felt like a piece of himself being torn away, an invasion of his private life that made him feel more exposed than ever. They took every personal object and turned it into a tool for mockery, reducing his life and identity to mere objects they could throw, rip, or stomp on. Their message was clear. To them, he and everything he represented were worthless. The teenager's heart raced as he watched his belongings scattered across the ground, torn apart and trampled under the heels of these men. Desperation gripped him, a raw instinct kicking in, urging him to flee, to break free from the hateful circle that surrounded him. In one swift, sudden movement, he turned and tried to dart between two of the men, hoping that his speed and agility might give him a chance to escape. But the skinheads were ready for this. One of them grabbed his arm, yanking him back with a harsh pull, almost lifting him off his feet and sending him stumbling backward. Another stepped in front of him, blocking his path, his face twisted in a cold smirk as he placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, holding him in place. "Going somewhere?" the leader taunted, his voice thick with mockery. He gave a cruel laugh, shaking his head in amused disbelief. "Did you really think you could just walk away?" The others laughed, their harsh voices filled with scorn as they tightened their circle even further, closing off any possible escape route. The teenager's heart sank as he realized he was trapped, his attempt to flee only fueling their taunts and reinforcing his helplessness in their grasp. Another one of them leaned in, his face close enough that the boy could feel his breath. "We're not done with you yet," he whispered with a sinister smile. His grip tightened on the teenager's arm, the force painful and unrelenting, emphasizing that they were in control. Any hope of escape was crushed in that moment, as they made it clear that they wouldn't let him leave until they were satisfied with his humiliation. The boy looked around, panic filling his eyes as he struggled to catch his breath, realizing the full extent of his vulnerability. His quick attempt to break free had only reminded them of the power they held, and they seemed intent on making him pay for even daring to think he could get away. Seeing the fear and desperation in the teenager's eyes, the skinheads seemed emboldened, their sneers growing darker, their words dripping with a fresh layer of cruelty. They exchanged glances, as if silently agreeing to take things further, to push him past his breaking point. The leader stepped closer, his gaze filled with a cold, calculating menace. "You really think you can run from us?" he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're going anywhere until we're done with you?" He cracked his knuckles slowly, each pop echoing ominously in the tense silence, and leaned forward, his face inches from the boy's, his breath hot and rancid. Another one of the skinheads joined in, crossing his arms and smirking as he spoke. "Maybe we should teach him a lesson. Make sure he remembers who's in charge here." His tone was laced with contempt, his words a thinly veiled threat. He clenched his fist, holding it up just enough for the boy to see, each gesture meant to deepen the intimidation. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, the sense of dread overwhelming him as he realized that this was no longer just verbal abuse. They were looking at him like he was prey, something to be hunted and broken down. He took a shaky step back, but the circle closed tighter, the men surrounding him like a wall, each one blocking any possible path to freedom. One of the men leaned close to the teenager's ear, his voice barely a whisper, but dripping with malice. "Maybe we should rough you up a bit," he hissed, his tone sadistic. "Just to remind you what happens to people like you who don't know their place." The others laughed, nodding in agreement, each one adding their own taunts and threats. "Yeah, maybe a few bruises will help you understand," another sneered, his gaze predatory, as though the thought of inflicting pain was something he found amusing. Their threats hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight that made the teenager's knees feel weak. His mind raced, every instinct screaming for him to flee, to somehow escape, but he knew that they wouldn't let him go. They wanted to see him broken, his fear and helplessness fueling their twisted sense of power. The tension in the air thickened, and the teenager felt his heart pounding in his chest, every nerve in his body on high alert. He tried to brace himself, but before he could react, one of the skinheads stepped forward, his fist clenched tight, and swung. The punch landed hard against the boy's shoulder, jolting him backward, pain radiating through his body as he stumbled. The group erupted in cruel laughter, their voices filled with a sick satisfaction as they watched him struggle to regain his footing. The teenager gasped, the shock of the blow stealing his breath, his mind reeling as he tried to process what had just happened. His shoulder throbbed, the ache a brutal reminder of the reality he was trapped in. There would be no mercy here. The leader, grinning with dark triumph, stepped up next, his eyes glinting with malice as he raised his fist. "Not so tough now, huh?" he taunted, his words dripping with contempt. He swung again, this time aiming for the boy's ribs, the punch landing with a dull, sickening thud that left the teenager doubled over, clutching his side. The others looked on, energized by the violence, each one seeming more emboldened as they witnessed the boy's pain. One of them leaned down, his face close, sneering. "Welcome to reality," he spat, his voice a cold whisper as the teenager tried to straighten up, only to be met with another shove that sent him staggering. Another skinhead gave him a sharp push, followed by a kick to the back of his leg, causing him to stumble to his knees. The laughter grew louder, each blow fueling their sadistic pleasure, their sense of superiority in seeing him brought low, helpless at their feet. They looked down on him, their faces twisted with cruel amusement, taking in his fear and pain as if it were some twisted form of entertainment. The teenager's vision blurred with tears he fought to hold back, his body aching from the blows, his mind reeling with the realization of just how far they were willing to go. As the teenager knelt on the ground, clutching his side, a few passers-by in the park began to notice the commotion. They glanced over, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they took in the scene, a young boy surrounded by a group of men, their faces twisted with anger and contempt, their laughter echoing ominously through the quiet evening air. A young couple walking nearby slowed their steps, their eyes widening as they registered the violence unfolding before them. The woman reached out, grabbing her partner's arm, her face etched with worry. Should we call someone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her partner looked back at the group, then quickly turned his gaze away, his face pale with uncertainty. "And no, let's just go. We don't want any trouble," he murmured, casting a quick, fearful glance back at the skinheads. He gently pulled her along, and together they hurried away, avoiding eye contact with the men as if fearing they, too, would become targets. A few other park visitors noticed the scene, but most kept their distance, casting nervous glances as they passed, each one unwilling to interfere. An older man on a nearby bench looked on, shaking his head with a deep frown, but he remained seated, his hands gripping his walking stick as he murmured under his breath, "This is awful, someone should stop them," yet he stayed in place, his fear of confrontation stronger than his outrage. A mother pushing a stroller quickly turned her gaze away, shielding her child and moving to a different path, her face tense with anxiety. She muttered to herself, her voice filled with regret, "Poor kid, but I can't risk getting involved." The bystanders' faces reflected the same uneasy mixture of sympathy and fear. Each knew they were witnessing an injustice, something fundamentally wrong, yet they were paralyzed by the dread of becoming involved. Their eyes darted away, their steps quickening, as they chose to ignore the cries of a boy left vulnerable and alone. The teenager could feel their fleeting gazes, their quick glances filled with pity that never turned into action. He could sense the presence of people who saw his suffering but were too frightened to help, and it deepened his sense of isolation. He was surrounded by witnesses, yet none of them would intervene, leaving him alone in the grip of his tormentors. As the blows subsided for a moment, the teenager remained on his knees, his body throbbing with pain, his breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps. He kept his head lowered, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller, to disappear from the cruel eyes that watched him with such hateful satisfaction. The laughter and mocking words still echoed around him, but he tried to block them out, retreating inward, seeking some refuge within himself. The park, once filled with the comforting sounds of life, birds chirping, leaves rustling, people chatting, now felt cold and empty. The voices around him blended into a low hum of scorn and contempt, each one slicing through the remaining fragments of his dignity. He could feel every bruised muscle, every ache from their punches and kicks, but the physical pain was almost secondary to the humiliation that weighed him down, pressing on his heart and mind like a heavy shroud. He dared not look up, feeling the sting of unshed tears burning his eyes, knowing that any sign of emotion would only fuel their amusement. In his silence, he could sense their twisted pleasure, the thrill they took in his silent suffering. He fought to control his breathing, to steady his trembling hands, to preserve what little strength he had left. But every second that passed made it harder to hold himself together, to keep from breaking in front of them. The bystanders' hurried footsteps and muted whispers as they passed reminded him that help wasn't coming. He was truly alone, surrounded by people who saw his pain but chose to look away, their inaction adding another layer to his suffering. Each fleeting glance that met his bruised form and quickly turned away cut as deeply as the skinhead's fists had, amplifying his sense of abandonment and helplessness. The teenager's quiet suffering became a shield, a silent way to preserve the last shreds of his pride. He forced himself to endure, to take their insults, their jeers, and their kicks without a word, without a tear. But inside, his spirit faltered, a quiet, desperate cry rising within him, one that no one seemed willing to answer. As the teenager knelt on the ground, surrounded by laughter, jeers, and the cruel eyes of his tormentors, a deep sense of despair settled over him. Every ounce of strength he tried to hold onto was slipping away, replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to stretch endlessly within him. He was battered, humiliated, his spirit nearly broken, and in that moment, an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness took hold. His mind raced, grasping for any sliver of hope, any possible escape, but he found nothing. The world around him felt distant, blurred by pain and exhaustion, as if he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The sounds of their laughter echoed louder in his ears, mocking him, filling him with the sickening realization that there was no one who would step in, no one who would save him. For the first time, he felt truly abandoned, as though he didn't belong in the world around him, as though he had been reduced to nothing in the eyes of those who passed by. He felt their judgment, their avoidance, the quick glances of pity and the fears that made them walk away, leaving him to face his attackers alone. The weight of it pressed down on him, each second stretching out painfully as his body and mind fought to hold onto something, anything. A tear slipped down his cheek despite his efforts to hold it back, a silent acknowledgement of his powerlessness. He felt stripped of everything, his dignity, his safety, even his sense of self-worth, each element torn away piece by the relentless cruelty of the men around him. For the first time, he wondered if he would make it through, if he could hold on long enough to find a way out of this nightmare. He lowered his head, his hands gripping the dirt beneath him, fingers digging into the ground as if hoping it would anchor him, give him some sense of stability in a world that had turned against him. But even as he tried to steel himself, his heart sank, the deep, crushing despair pressing into him, making him feel smaller and more alone than ever. Just as the darkness of despair seemed to close in completely, the teenager heard the sound of approaching footsteps, calm, purposeful, unhurried. The men surrounding him didn't notice at first, too absorbed in their mockery and cruelty, but the teenager's gaze shifted slightly, catching sight of a familiar figure moving steadily toward them. It was his father. Clad in his police uniform, his expression unreadable yet focused, his presence carried a weight that cut through the cruel laughter like a blade. He moved with a quiet authority, each step deliberate, his gaze locked onto the group tormenting his son. The teenager's heart surged with a mixture of relief and disbelief, a spark of hope reigniting within him as he realized his father had been watching, that he hadn't been abandoned after all. The skinheads, finally sensing something amiss, turned to see the man standing behind them. They exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering as they recognized the uniform and the steely, unyielding expression on his face. The father's calm, piercing gaze held them in place, a silent warning that needed no words. His presence alone seemed to strip away their power, the men who had moments ago exuded arrogance and cruelty now shifting uncomfortably under his unflinching stare. The father took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice low and filled with an authority that made the men flinch. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm but unmistakably threatening, each word laced with an unspoken promise that he was not one to be trifled with. The leader of the skinheads opened his mouth to respond, but his words died on his lips. He was caught off guard, the situation no longer in his control, his confidence slipping away under the weight of the father's gaze. The others, once so confident in their numbers, looked to each other in confusion and fear, their strength suddenly diminished in the face of someone who clearly held more power than they ever would. For the teenager, the sight of his father standing there, unwavering and resolute, filled him with a sense of safety he hadn't felt since the torment began. The man who had raised him, who had taught him about justice and strength, was here, and in that moment, he knew that the nightmare was finally ending. The father, his face a mask of steely resolve, took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the group of skinheads. Each step he took seemed to magnify the tension, his presence pressing down on them with an authority they could not ignore. The men shifted nervously, their previous arrogance evaporating as he approached, his uniform a stark reminder of the power he wielded. He moved slowly, his gaze sweeping over each of them, lingering on their faces as if to memorize every detail. His eyes, calm but intense, held a promise, one that needed no words to convey. They flinched under his scrutiny, their confidence unraveling as the full weight of their actions seemed to dawn on them. The father's silence was unnerving, each step heightening their discomfort, their former bravado replaced by a wary unease. The leader of the group tried to recover his composure, straightening his posture and meeting the father's gaze with a forced sneer. "We were just having a bit of fun," he muttered, his voice lacking the conviction it had moments ago. But the father's expression remained unchanged, his cold stare cutting through the man's flimsy defense, making it clear that he wasn't fooled. Stopping just a few feet away, the father crossed his arms, his stance steady, exuding an authority that none of them could match. He didn't need to raise his voice, his very presence spoke louder than any threat could. "Fun," he repeated quietly, his tone carrying an edge sharp enough to make them all tense. "Is that what you call this?" He gestured subtly toward his son, who was still on the ground, bruised and humiliated, the evidence of their cruelty visible to anyone with eyes. One of the skinheads took a nervous step back, his gaze darting between the father and his friends, unsure of what to do. The group's unity was beginning to fracture, each man realizing that this encounter was spiraling out of their control. The father's calm demeanor, laced with barely contained anger, was far more intimidating than any threat or raised voice. Another skinhead muttered something under his breath, his voice tinged with frustration, but he fell silent the moment the father's gaze shifted to him, piercing and unyielding. They were caught, unable to escape the reckoning they had brought upon themselves, their hateful actions now exposed to someone who would not back down. The father took another step forward, his voice low but filled with authority as he addressed the entire group. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next," he said, each word deliberate, carrying a weight that left no room for misinterpretation. Without breaking eye contact with the group, the father took another step forward, closing the gap between him and the skinheads, his presence radiating a calm, controlled fury. His son's bruised and shaken form behind him was a powerful reminder of what these men had done, and there was no way he was going to let them walk away without consequences. He pointed a finger at the leader, his voice steady and firm. "Stand back," he commanded, the quiet authority in his tone making it clear that this wasn't a request. The leader hesitated, glancing around at his friends for support, but they were frozen, unsure how to react under the intimidating gaze of a uniformed officer. One of the skinheads sneered, trying to mask his fear with defiance. "And what are you gonna do about it?" he muttered, his voice shaky despite his attempt at bravado. But before he could say anything else, the father's gaze fixed on him, a hard, unblinking stare that cut through any remaining bravado. What I'm going to do, he said, his voice chillingly calm, is hold every one of you accountable for what you've done here today. He let the words hang in the air, their weight settling heavily over the men. His tone left no room for doubt. They had crossed the line, and there would be consequences. Without waiting for a response, the father reached for his radio, calmly calling for backup, his eyes never leaving the group. Officer requesting immediate assistance at the park, he spoke clearly, his words steady and deliberate, each syllable punctuated with unyielding resolve. The realization hit the skinheads like a shockwave. He wasn't just going to lecture them or scare them off. He was taking real, legal action, turning their intimidation into a matter of law. The leader of the skinheads took a step back, his confidence visibly crumbling as he processed the seriousness of the situation. He looked around, realizing that every possible escape was blocked. Each step he might take watched with laser focus by the officer standing before him. The others shuffled nervously, the weight of their actions settling on them with a clarity that had not been there before. The father moved to stand protectively in front of his son, his stance unmovable, his gaze still locked onto the men who had inflicted so much pain. "You thought you'd walk away from this, didn't you?" he said, his voice low but deadly. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted without consequences." The skinheads were silent, the arrogance that had fueled their cruelty moments ago completely gone. They were left to stand there, waiting, the father's intervention a relentless force that stripped away every ounce of power they once held. For the first time, they felt the fear of facing justice, of being seen for who they really were, of being held accountable by someone who wouldn't turn a blind eye. The father's confidence radiated like an impenetrable shield, his unwavering gaze locking onto each of the skinheads, making it clear that he was in full control of the situation. Standing tall, he maintained a calm but commanding stance, his presence a stark contrast to the men who now stood before him, stripped of their earlier bravado. He didn't need to raise his voice or make any threatening gestures. His confidence and authority spoke volumes, leaving no doubt that he would not tolerate any further defiance. He took a step forward, his eyes hard and piercing as he looked directly at the leader. "You've already made your choices," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "Now, you'll face the consequences." The simple statement, delivered with calm assurance, was more powerful than any threat could have been. It was a statement of fact, not open to interpretation or negotiation. The leader opened his mouth, perhaps to argue or attempt some last-ditch justification, but the words faltered under the intensity of the father's stare. One of the other men shuffled uncomfortably, the realization of their helplessness sinking in, their power dynamic completely reversed. The father continued, each word slow and deliberate. "What you did today, the hatred, the violence, that's on you. And you will answer for it." His voice was filled with a quiet fury, each sentence carrying a weight that made the men feel smaller, more exposed, as though every cruel action they'd committed was now under a magnifying glass. One of the skinheads shifted nervously, glancing at his friends, but none of them could meet the father's gaze. The bravado they had wielded with such ease was gone, replaced by a creeping fear that they couldn't ignore. They knew that arguing, running, or denying would be pointless. They were dealing with someone who wouldn't back down, someone who wasn't afraid to bring them to justice. The father's hand rested calmly by his side, his fingers poised to act if necessary, his stance rooted and unwavering. He looked to his son briefly, a reassuring nod that conveyed safety and strength, then returned his gaze to the group. "Now," he said, his voice low and full of authority, "you're going to wait right here until help arrives." With that final command, he stood his ground, a silent force of protection and justice. As the father's calm command settled over them, the men stood frozen, feeling the weight of authority pressing down on them in a way they hadn't anticipated. Moments before, They had felt untouchable, emboldened by their numbers and cruelty. But now, faced with a man of unshakable resolve, backed by the full force of the law, their bravado dissolved into unease and fear. The crackle of a radio echoed through the stillness of the park, signaling that backup was on its way. The father maintained his intense gaze, watching every movement of the group as they shifted nervously, glancing at one another in desperation. Their realization was clear. This was no longer an act of intimidation. They had stepped into something far greater than their hateful games. They were about to confront the full consequences of their actions, under the scrutiny of an officer determined to hold them accountable. One of the skinheads, struggling to recover his confidence, scoffed, though his voice wavered. "You think you can just ruin our lives over a little fun," he muttered, but even he could hear the weakness in his own words, the futile attempt to dismiss the severity of what they had done. The father's gaze hardened, his voice even and controlled. "You ruined your own lives when you decided to spread hate," he replied, leaving no room for argument. His words were a declaration, as final as a judge's gavel. The men were trapped, not just physically, but by the undeniable truth in his statement. The father's presence was unrelenting, and as the sounds of approaching sirens filled the air, the skinheads' last semblance of control crumbled completely. They shifted anxiously, looking over their shoulders, their faces pale as they realized there was no escape. Their actions, which had once seemed to them like an assertion of power, had now flipped, leaving them vulnerable and exposed before a system they could not evade. When the police vehicles arrived, officers stepped out, taking in the scene with stern expressions. The father calmly addressed his colleagues, briefly explaining what had happened, his voice steady, recounting the violence his son had endured with a detachment that only underscored his strength. The other officers nodded, their gazes turning cold as they took in the group of men before them, now looking defeated and utterly deflated. One by one, the skinheads were cuffed, their hands bound behind them, their heads hanging low. The gravity of their actions, once trivialized by their hateful confidence, now settled on them fully, their faces etched with fear as they felt the weight of authority finally catch up with them. As the police officers moved in, the skinheads' defiance crumbled completely. One by one, the officers approached each man, their movements swift and practiced, snapping handcuffs around the wrists of the once proud aggressors. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the quiet park, a stark reminder of the finality of their actions. The skinheads, who had moments before sneered and jeered with unchecked cruelty, now stood subdued, their heads lowered, their eyes averted, stripped of any remnants of power. The leader, whose arrogance had once fueled the others, now looked hollow, his shoulders slumped as an officer guided his hands behind his back, securing him with an unyielding grip. He winced as the cuffs locked, the cold steel biting into his wrists, a sharp contrast to the confidence he displayed earlier. The other members of the group exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale, each realizing that the game was over, that this was no longer a scene they controlled. The father watched the arrests with quiet satisfaction, his expression unreadable, though a sense of justice flickered in his eyes. He stood protectively beside his son, his presence a silent but powerful message to the men being led away. His son, though bruised and shaken, looked up at his father with a mixture of awe and gratitude, comforted by the fact that justice was unfolding before his eyes. The officers moved efficiently, each skinhead now bound and surrounded, forced to face the consequences they had once so confidently evaded. Some passers-by, who had earlier been afraid to intervene, now gathered at a distance, watching the scene with a mix of relief and satisfaction. Whispers of approval rippled through the small crowd, and a few nodded with quiet respect toward the father, recognizing his strength and the justice he had brought to his son. As the skinheads were led toward the police vehicles, their faces twisted in shame and defeat, the father placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Together, They watched the men who had tormented him disappear into the back of the police cars, no longer the menacing figures they had been, but just individuals now stripped of power, forced to answer for the harm they had inflicted. The officers closed the doors of the police vehicles, locking away the remnants of hate and cruelty that had shattered the peace of that day. The father's gaze remained steady, his silent presence reminding everyone that justice, when carried out with strength and integrity, could prevail over even the darkest moments. As the police vehicles pulled away, a quiet murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers who had gathered at a distance. Faces once filled with fear and hesitation now showed a mixture of relief, admiration, and even awe. The events that had unfolded, the cruelty, the father's intervention, and the swift, decisive justice had left an indelible mark on each of them. A woman holding her child close shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't believe what I just saw," she whispered to her friend. "Those men thought they could get away with such hatred, but that father, he was incredible." Nearby, an older couple exchanged glances, the man nodding solemnly. He stood up to them without a hint of fear. "I didn't think anyone would step in, and then he just handled it." His voice was filled with respect, his words echoing the admiration felt by many in the crowd. Some onlookers, who had been reluctant to get involved earlier, now seemed ashamed of their silence. They realized how close they had come to being mere witnesses to a brutal act without ever intervening. The father's courage and unwavering stance had reminded them of their own responsibility, leaving them with a sense of humility and gratitude that justice had been served, even if it wasn't by their own hands. A few people quietly applauded, their claps soft but filled with sincerity. The crowd's attention shifted to the father and son, both standing together, a powerful image of resilience and protection. People nodded and murmured words of respect and admiration, some even wiping away tears. They recognized that they had witnessed not just a moment of justice, but a profound reminder of the power of love and strength. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached the father, offering quiet words of gratitude and support. Some extended hands, others simply nodded, acknowledging the bravery he had shown. For many, the events of that day would remain a vivid memory, a lesson in standing up against hatred, and a reminder of the strength that could be found in those who refused to let injustice pass unnoticed. As the last of the crowd dispersed, the father turned to his son, his stern expression softening as he took in the boy's bruised face and shaken frame. He placed a firm, comforting hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him in the warmth and strength of his presence. His gaze was filled with a deep love and concern, but also with a quiet pride. The father took a steadying breath, then spoke, his voice gentle yet filled with the weight of his words. "Son, I know today was terrifying, and what those men did to you was beyond wrong. No one should ever face something like that just because of who they are." He paused, his eyes searching his son's face, making sure the boy was absorbing every word. "But I want you to remember something, you are never alone. You carry within you strength and dignity that no one can take away." The boy looked down, still shaken, but he nodded, feeling his father's steady hand on his shoulder, a reminder of the unwavering support he could always count on. The father continued, his tone gentle but firm. "You saw today how hatred can drive people to do terrible things, but you also saw that justice is there for those who stand strong. Always remember, you have a right to walk through this world with pride. No one, no matter how cruel or full of hate, can take away your worth. And it's my job to make sure you know that and carry it with you, no matter where you go." The teenager lifted his gaze, meeting his father's eyes. He could see the pride and fierce protectiveness there, and in that moment, he felt some of his fear and hurt begin to ease, replaced by a newfound sense of strength and resolve. "Sometimes," the father continued, his voice softer now, we have to face darkness to understand our own strength. You faced it today, and you came through. Hold your head high, because you deserve to. And know that I'll always be here to stand with you." The boy swallowed, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a deep sense of gratitude. He nodded, a small but determined smile forming on his face as he absorbed his father's words. He felt empowered by the reminder of his own strength, anchored by the knowledge that he had a protector who would always stand beside him. Together, they began to walk home, the father's arm around his son, a silent symbol of support and the powerful bond that no amount of hatred could ever break. As they walked together, father and son, a renewed sense of strength settled over them. The boy, though still bruised and shaken, felt something deeper blossoming within him, a profound understanding of justice and the power of standing up against hatred. Today had been a painful reminder of the ugliness in the world, but it had also shown him the resilience he carried inside, a strength that his father had helped him find, even in the face of darkness. The father, his protective arm around his son's shoulder, felt a similar sense of fulfillment. Justice had been served not only through the actions of law, but through his unwavering support and the courage he had helped instill in his son. He knew this day would stay with his boy, but he also knew that it would be a source of strength, a lesson that would shape the young man he would one day become. For the onlookers who had witnessed the events unfold, the scene was unforgettable. They had seen hatred and prejudice exposed and, in response, had witnessed the calm but powerful assertion of justice. The father's actions had reminded them that true strength lies not in cruelty or intimidation, but in standing firm for what is right, even when fear threatens to keep them silent. The justice served that day was not merely a punishment for those who inflicted harm, but a statement, a resounding reminder of what was possible when good people refused to stand aside. As they walked, the boy felt the weight of his father's words and the unspoken message in his actions. He understood now that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring dignity, about showing the world that no one, no matter how vulnerable, would face cruelty alone. His father had shown him that justice could be both fierce and compassionate, a force that could protect and uplift, even in the bleakest moments. The boy walked a little taller, his bruises a reminder of the day's hardships, but his heart full of a newfound sense of courage. He had seen the power of justice firsthand and knew that it was something worth fighting for, a force that could bring light to even the darkest of times. The strength of his father, the power of justice, and the resilience he now carried within him would guide him forward, a lasting source of empowerment and purpose. As father and son continued their walk home, the day's events left a lasting impression, one that would shape them both in profound ways. They had faced hate and cruelty head-on, but through the strength of love, courage, and unwavering support, they emerged with a deeper understanding of justice and the power of standing up for what is right. The boy had learned that while there is darkness in the world, there is also light, a light that comes from those who refuse to bow to prejudice, who stand tall and defend dignity even in the face of intimidation. His father had shown him that true strength lies not in physical power, but in the courage to protect others and uphold what is just. This experience had given him more than resilience, it had given him purpose. For the father, the day was a confirmation of everything he believed about his duty to his family and to the world around him. He had not only protected his son, but also shown him that justice could be a force of compassion, one that restores dignity and empowers the vulnerable. He hoped that his actions would inspire his son to carry these values forward, to live with integrity, and to never allow anyone to undermine his worth. The onlookers, too, left with their own lessons, reminded of the power of one person's courage to stand against many. The father's calm assertion of justice had shown them that while fear can make people turn away, bravery can inspire action and respect, even from a distance. In witnessing this act of courage, they saw that each of them had the potential to do the same, to stand up, to speak out, to protect those who need it. In the end, this day was more than just an ordeal. It was a lesson in resilience, in the importance of family, and in the unbreakable power of justice. They would both carry this experience forward, a shared memory that would remind them of the values they upheld together. The bruises would fade, but the strength and wisdom gained would last a lifetime, guiding them in every step they took, a testament to the enduring power of love, dignity, and justice. Friends, what do you think about this powerful story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed moments of racism or injustice in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Each of your stories matters greatly to us. Remember, you are incredibly important to our community, and we value every single one of you. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue to share meaningful content that connects us all. Thank you for being here, and have a wonderful day filled with kindness and courage.